So hello and welcome. We've got a packed episode today as we talk through some of the key trends regarding our latest commercial property trends report covering the Q1 of 2025. My name's Josh Range, Managing Director of Landmark Geodata, and I'm joined by a very special guest, and that's David Bain, Head of Content at Barbour ABI. Welcome along and thanks for joining us today, David.
Hi, thanks very much for having me.
Super. So we're thrilled to have David here with us today because Barbour is a partner that we've worked with for a long time, thinking over a decade at this point, across our planning applications data. So if anyone understands the world of upcoming property landscape and the transactions and the pipeline that we believe will bring forward, it's going to be the team, David and the team at Barbour. So David, with that in mind, could you give us a bit of insight into your role at Barbour, please?
Yes, sure. So I'm head of content for the market research reports that we produce at Barbour ABI. Your listeners may know, but Barbour ABI is the UK's leading construction and planning intelligence provider. So we track the entire development life cycle from planning to completion and cover all sectors of the built environment. So that's what Barbour ABI do as a whole. We also produce market research reports for many aspects of the built environment. So there's about 150 in total, something like that. And these range from reports focused on products like floor coverings or underfloor heating to those focusing on sectors. So we've recently published reports on social housing, education, and data centres, for instance. So that's the part of the organisation that I work in. So I'm the head of the content for those reports. And just to mention, those reports are used by a whole range of people, from product manufacturers to tier one contractors, merchants, retailers, developers, investors, consultancies, a real range. And they're using that data to help inform their strategy, which could be to invest in certain products where there are trends showing that there's going to be increased demand, or certain sectors maybe that are looking healthy, or perhaps regions of the UK where business looks good for the area they work in.
Fabulous, thanks, David. I think it's exactly that, isn't it? It's that pipeline of activity that we see go through the industry, and not the knowledge of when the sort of top of the pipe is filling up with content, what that could mean for all of the downstream services that are applied both across the property but also construction sort of aspects. So I think to kick off our discussion today, we're talking around our commercial property trends report, and I'll give a bit of context with regards to the activity that we've seen. So from Landmark's perspective, and this is where we dovetail so nicely with the data that we can see across the planning activity, with our capability of seeing across the transactional, the commercial property trends, we're able to look into a number of different data points that we see, planning being a key aspect of those. But what we typically see alongside planning is commercial property search reports, both across England and Wales. So within England and Wales, we saw those sort of trending down 15% in Q1 of 2025 versus 24. Alongside that, and in the slightly different process, but within Scotland, we see similar sort of search orders coming through. Actually, these were 11% up across that sort of same period, Q1 25 to 24. And those are sort of two key touch points that we see in the transactional market. Supporting alongside those, we have environmental due diligence activity that happens across the industry, whether that be a sort of flood assessment or preliminary risk assessment. We can see a lot of those, and again, activity sort of up 6% year on year across that period of time. So this is where we tend to see the earliest stage of our life cycle start to come in to fruition from the commercial property transaction process. But moving on to sort of our first key topic of the day in the large-scale planning applications, the statistics that really jumped out, the fact that large applications were down during Q1 25 to 24, so 23%. Could you talk to a bit of what could be sort of affecting those, or the behaviours that you've sort of seen from your side?
Yes, of course. So there are signs that clients are holding back a bit on some projects. So I know it's in the news all the time, and everyone's talking about it. But the current environment that we're in, the international trading environment, for instance, continues to be unpredictable, and the economic outlook in the UK still looks very subdued. and business and consumer confidence is low, really. So this combines with cost pressures. So the much talked about increase in national insurance contributions that's just kicked in recently. Despite weaker demand, also the cost of some materials has increased recently too. So all of this means that clients do appear to be holding back, at least in some cases, on some of the major spending decisions. Some are being pushed back until there's more certainty. So that might mean later this year or perhaps going into 2026. And it applies in particular to some of the major new tower projects and large refurb, those kinds of things. But on the positive side, there are some kind of good things to mention, I think. So there's the recently announced trade deal with the US, and I know that's really early days. We don't quite know how that's going to pan out, but maybe that might provide some stability. And then, there's the reduction in the Bank of England base rate recently, which perhaps those rates aren't coming down as quickly as people might like, but it might start to help ease things a little bit. So there's some of the sort of macro things, that I think are affecting the commercial property market at the moment.
Yeah, I can completely agree, and I think it's always the case that we're looking for any single point of answer that sort of dictates and sort of encourages confidence in the market. But the real factor really is it's across all of these. It's both on the grand sort of macro scale that we see sort of international and national scale the changes that will influence confidence, all the way down to sort of regional and domestic sort of changes which moves them forward. So it's a difficult one when you always look for the simple and easy answer, but I think the story being that it really tends to sort of span across a few different pieces. But I think like you say, keeping on that theme of positivity, because why wouldn't we? There are some sectors that have sort of bucked that trend, and the Barbour data in sort of 2024 showed that commercial, retail, infrastructure sectors have seen some sort of growth. Do you think there's an area that sort of begins to continue through 2025, and is any sort of points that you would draw that would come down to?
I think there are some areas. I think it's a mixed picture.
Yeah.
So planning applications for commercial have remained fairly resilient, but some other indicators do suggest that commercial activity is falling. Large commercial planning applications are lower in Q1 this year compared to the same quarter last year, especially in value terms. So perhaps not as many of the larger projects, which does reflect that kind of risk aversity I was talking about earlier in terms of particularly like large tower projects and those sorts of things. And of course, a few very large projects can skew the data a bit. So there were a few of those early last year, which kind of pushed things up. But having said that, compared to the rest of 2024, applications in the first quarter of 2025 have kind of held up. And there are still some, large commercial applications that are either being submitted or being approved. So the £500 million St Mary's Axe project, for instance, and then the Euston Tower, £400 million project, recently been approved. So there are things like that which are happening. Our latest construction industry monthly snapshot report actually shows commercial and retail planning applications bouncing back, increasing threefold from a weaker March. So in terms of the most recent month of April. So that's a month-to-month change, and those can fluctuate, but that's a more positive month than the last one. And that included a large £500 million office development in London. So there's those things, and while activity for commercial and retail projects overall may have slowed, some subsectors remain strong. So there's retail, for instance, which I know over the longer term hasn't had a hard time, but it's not been faring so badly of late, with number of food retail projects increasing compared to last year. One of the strongest areas, though, is like high-tech offices, computer centres, which includes things like data centres. And that's risen each year and grown substantially in value in terms in Q1 this year. And we actually did a report on that last year, which again showed really strong growth, and we've forecasted really substantial growth over the next kind of 4 years. So, there's some positive signs there.
Mm.
And then another area to mention is kind of biotech and life science projects. So that's another area where we've seen that faring a bit better than maybe other types of commercial projects. And then perhaps the final kind of sort of sector to mention is infrastructure, where there's been a lot of planning activity recently, particularly for green energy projects. And then, of course, there's the ongoing, large, huge projects like Hinkley Point C and HS2, which will continue to sort of maintain things throughout the year as well.
Obvious. And I think speaking to a colleague of yours regarding the data center piece, is there any sort of geographic variation that you could point to any of these sort of highly performing sectors that jumps out to you guys?
I mean, I think that a lot of the development in that area, I think, has been quite London and southeast centric, but I think there are some signs that it's not just in that part of the country where some of these projects are happening. There are some quite large projects that are either where planning has been approved or that the planning application has been submitted in other parts of the country. There's actually one quite near where I am in the northeast, near Blyden, Northumberland, which is huge. I think it's £10 billion project. It's kind of meant to be over its lifetime. So, there are projects like that, and some in other parts of the north of the UK as well. So it's, there are projects across the country in that subsector.
Yeah, I guess the other point to consider as part of these is the interconnectedness of some of them. So high resource demand sort of data centers and requirements for power, and how that would link to some of the infrastructure and type planning activity that we may see in the future as sort of policy grows and technology advances. I think the interesting point that we should expect to see is that interconnectedness between the changing behavior of either just the workplace or domestic with regards to the use of AI, therefore the demand of data centers, therefore the demand of power, and how that sort of flow of planning requirements flows through the pipeline industry as a whole.
Definitely.
Yeah, and I guess before we sort of move on, is there any other aspects of the large sort of planning application sector that jumped out to you?
I don't think so. But your point there about that connectedness and data centers in particular, obviously very power hungry, especially with AI, and the fact that that's becoming adopted quite quickly only suggests there's going to be more and more of that, and a lot of the data centers are planning for that, in terms of the combining those projects with renewable energy generation at the same time. Being mindful of that that use of power.
Yeah, long goes the concern of National Grid of everyone turning their kettles on at the same time, but instead coming to everyone asking a question of AI or to move forward. Maybe a bit too simplistic, but So looking sort of a bit more broadly at the industry, smaller scale applications now, I guess, be even more so a bit of variation in terms of what can influence those. We've seen sort of comparable activity from our side, and obviously even sort of considering the challenges that go into the market, sort of a positive there and sort of seeing comparative on the previous year. But I guess the question is, are we consolidating against a low base in 2024, or is there sort of actual reasonable activity that's been spread across those for the last 2 years? What's your view on the smaller planning application space?
Yeah, I mean, I think you make a good point that it is kind of a lower ebb, and I think there is data to show that it's at the moment, recently, perhaps it's not kind of falling or anything like that at the moment, but I think there are some suggestions it might do later in the year. There has been a trend of kind of quite a lot of office activity in terms of conversions and improving the quality of offices. While some of those might be larger projects, it can affect some smaller ones as well. So with encouraging people back to the office and kind of planning for hybrid working, that kind of thing. And that will probably, I think, continue fairly well to some extent. But as I say, that's not just smaller projects. I think in terms of retail, there's obviously a lot of challenges there, but there have been the change of use kind of applications that have been happening. So sometimes changing from retail to leisure, for instance, where perhaps shops aren't doing so well, so they kind of change to a different type of use that might fare better. And I think shops are having to keep kind of reinvent themselves to a certain extent in the high street with all the challenges they're continually facing from online and out of town shopping centres and that kind of thing. So, but whilst there has been some of that activity, I think there is a feeling that may not kind of hold up quite so well in the coming year. And of course, a lot of the organisations, like everybody, but who will be owning and running and managing these facilities, will be also affected by national insurance contribution increases and the national living wage, which could just make spending decisions a bit more difficult. With the inflationary pressures remaining still, interest rates coming down only slowly, it does make people, I think, a bit more wary of making any big decisions just now.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess, are there any other standout points from a smaller scale planning activity that you'd want to call out as part of this process?
I don't think so. No, not at the moment.
No, sure. Super. I think so. Give me. So I think the final point when we look with regards to the planning landscape, it would be remiss of us not to sort of talk around the current regulatory environment when it comes to planning, in light of both the National Planning Policy Framework and the Planning and Infrastructure Bill. Are you seeing any trends emerging in the data? Obviously, fairly early days, but any trends emerging to the data that can correlate back to these policy changes?
Yes, it is quite early days with the National Planning Policy Framework having been published in December and the Planning and Infrastructure Bill currently going through Parliament. That said, we are seeing a lot of infrastructure planning activity. I mentioned the green energy projects before, and we are seeing quite a lot of that happening at the moment. So, whether that's aligned to some of those regulatory changes, potentially there could be some of that. But we do anticipate these changes helping to get projects through the planning system. I think we see that as a positive in helping to provide a bit of a catalyst there. It's just that we may see a bit of a lag before we see significant activity from it coming through. Obviously, once the bill is successfully goes through Parliament, assuming it does, and then there are other factors still, so resourcing issues for local authorities. I know we're talking mainly about commercial property here, but say for student university accommodation, that'll be affected by if it's high-rise, high-risk buildings, and therefore the building safety regulator, and there's the delays associated with that at the moment. And then, of course, there's the shortage of experienced, skilled construction workers, which remains a concern. So I think those reforms are positive and I'm sure will help. But obviously, there's still these other challenges that kind of go alongside that, really. So.
Yeah, I think you're completely right. That sort of the overwhelming sort of position that I sort of hear is that there's belief and intent that these changes move in the right direction, but the practicalities of executing on them are not going to happen immediately and overnight, just from a sort of capability of resources across the sort of sector, but also that factor of prioritizing the right sites. We're going to have an opportunity now to review not just new potential sites, and we'll talk a bit about that in a second, but also revisiting old sites which may have had a refusal, may have had a sort of condition that needed to be accepted, that actually could be re-looked at, either for a different use case as we go through the local plans processes again, but also conditions actually meet the criteria. So I think there's going to be this real balance between the legislation sort of coming in and then the practicalities of that working once it's the sort of a market can choose across and prioritize the sites that we see. One of the sort of influencing factors, I guess, that stands out with that is grey belt and the definition and the criteria, sort of one side of that gets reported quite frequently, previously developed sites in greenfield, but actually the other sort of aspect of green belt is all around not is all around containing sort of and not connecting too many urban areas. But actually, what we're seeing now is that definition is as it's adopted and learnt more within the industry is as long as it's not contributing to that, it could also be considered sort of grey belt. So I guess where does that stand out from your perspective? Again, is there an anticipation in terms of the data that we should start to see, or anything that jumps out from Barbour's view there?
Yeah, so I think there's an anticipation. I think we would expect to see more activity in areas that would be defined as grey belt. I think in terms of having kind of much in the way of figures to show a definite kind of trend of sort of activity there, I'm not sure at the moment that there is that just at the moment. After these kind of only a few months of legislation being in place that is going to make that happen. But I think there are some anecdotal examples of where projects that have previously been refused planning permission or may not have received planning permission have gone ahead, on appeal. I think we mentioned data centres. So there's a data centre in Buckinghamshire which was called in and granted after having been refused planning permission because it was in the Greenbelt area. So, that does suggest that new framework is going to start to maybe lead to some different decisions being made. I guess you would expect that to then lead to maybe some, more applications being put in for areas which are defined as grey belt where maybe they wouldn't have been before. We'll obviously, keep track of this going forward because it's a really interesting area to see what happens here and what kind of a wider impact it might have, on some of the things that you've just mentioned about kind of urban sprawl and those sorts of things, and how it plays out in terms of the way that the media and communities actually respond to it as well.
Yeah, exactly that because of the community positioning of it, particularly when we start to take into account the definition that gets reported regularly versus the sort of definition that's written into the NPPF is going to be a fascinating sort of realization of which sites can be taken forward, but then also how that definition gets leveraged into local plans as we go through that sort of renewal process for the next sort of round of local plans is where there's allocations which previously were limited to one type of use case are going to start to jump out into a new one, which is going to be interesting.
Yeah, yes, definitely.
As our Q1 25 commercial property trend report attests, I think the only sort of certainty that we can look forward is to a period of continued sort of learning and understanding and potentially starting with uncertainty, but moving into certainty as we start to get a bit more practical demonstrations of how both new definitions but also new approaches and sort of understanding of planning acceptance move forward. It's going to be fascinating to see how the rest of 2025 plays out and what trends emerge in the commercial property sector, and as David mentioned, particularly in those spaces with regards to green infrastructure and data centres and all of the sort of contributing factors that support the wider economic growth from those sectors. If you'd like to read more of the report for yourself, please visit landmark.co.uk, click News and Insights, and head to the Industry Reports section. Thank you very much for listening.